see you guys all here this morning. Wow, we have had some weather lately, right? I was telling somebody that I think those of us that were teachers who were expecting a snow day, we were all expecting a snow day. And I knew better. Okay, you guys that know me, I grew up when I was a kid in Oklahoma, and we would have cars sliding all over the streets, and we would still go to school. But as I went to school the other day, I noticed that the people that were angry that there wasn't a snow day was not the kids. It was the teachers. The kids looked normal, and they acted normal. It was the adults that were angry, and by adults and other teachers, I mean myself. That was me. I was angry that we didn't have a snow day. You should have seen the look on the teachers at the high school stage. We were all just... and, all my classes were like half full. But anyway, so, we've had some several years ago, I had a student in class. Now, I've been with you guys long enough where I don't know if I've told you this story before. I forget what stories I've told you, and if it's anything like my history class, my students will say, Lohan, you told us this. So anyway, but if you've heard this before, pretend you haven't, okay? So anyway, I had this student in class. It was AP US History. It was a college-level class. And every time I would get up to lecture or do notes, this kid would just stare at me. He would never take notes. When we did assignments, he would do okay on assignments, but he was not near among the top of my class as far as grades went. And like I said, I give a lot of notes, and this student would never take the notes. He would just sit there. And when it came time for a test, he would get maybe a C at best. Sometimes he'd get a D. And I would get frustrated because I knew this kid. And I knew in my mind he was a really smart kid, and he would do so much better if he would just write notes when I get up there and teach. He was a good kid, he was funny, he was smart. It just seemed to me that he didn't try very hard. And when I was younger, maybe I took myself a little too seriously, and that just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. And I mean, this was an AP class, right? A student shouldn't just be chilling there, doing nothing when the teacher's teaching. Well, if you guys don't know, in AP classes in May, students from around the country take the AP exam that corresponds to whatever class they're taking. In this case, it would be the U.S. History exam. So, if the students get a score of a 3, a 4, or a 5 on the exam, they earn college credit when they go to college. Now, this means something different for different colleges, but my youngest nephew passed the AP U.S. History test, and when he went to college, he didn't have to spend money to take a U.S. History class that freshmen were required to take. So that's what college credit meant for him. He didn't have to take a class, saved himself probably, I don't know, anywhere from $800 to $1,000 not having to take a class. So, you get college credit if you pass. So anyway, I would sometimes give this kid a hard time about not taking notes. I would point out to him the good students that took notes every day. I'd be like, hey man, look at this kid over here, they do it every day, and they're killing these tests. And the student would be like, oh, I know, not really fight or argue, just be like, oh, I know. And I would say, dude, you're a smart kid. Like, if you would just take the notes, you would learn the material better. But he insisted that he didn't need to take the notes. He remembered. And, I would look at his test scores and be like, okay. Anyway, sometimes, like I said, occasionally I would even call, not directly out of class, and be like, maybe we should be taking notes today, everybody. Well, anyway, one day I made him a deal. And I did it in front of, and I pulled him aside. I said, look, I'm going to make you a deal. If you pass the AP test at the end of the year, which means you get a 3 or a 4 or a 5, I will buy you dinner anywhere you want in the Antelope Valley. I'll go get you a gift card, and I'll buy you dinner if you pass. And I said, but if you fail the test, you've got to come to my AP US History class next year, and you've got to stand in front of the class, and you've got to say, hey guys, Mr. Lawhon always tried to get me to take notes, and I never did, and you guys need to take notes. You have to give a speech in front of my class. And guess what? He says, okay, I'll do that. Well, he agreed, and the AP test rolled around, and when the scores came out, this dude made a 4, a second highest score that you can make on the AP test. Blew it out of the water. So when everybody came back to school next year, all my students, they all knew and they said, Lon, did he pass? And I said, yes, he passed. So in front of all my students, I gave him money to buy dinner anywhere he wanted to in the Antelope Valley. All right, I got him a gift card. I said, listen, $35. That'll buy you a meal and dessert and whatever, drink. But anyway, he did it. Now, as a teacher, I learned a very, very important lesson here. I had a preconceived notion of what students needed to do and the actions they needed to take in order to be successful. I looked at students that came into my class, had their eyes on me taking notes, actively participating. I said in my mind, this is a good student. This is success. And students that came in and sat around and halfway participated or didn't participate at all, I said in my mind, this is not a successful student. I had students in my class that I thought sadly, man, why can't everybody behave like this student that's doing everything right? But let me tell you, that year, I was humbled. It's one of the many times as a teacher that I have been humbled. Now, what does this have to do with anything? Well, if you'd like to join me in your Bibles, today we're going to take our passage from Luke chapter 18. If you've been with us the past several Sundays, we've been studying the parables of Jesus. Last week, we studied the parable of the foolish builder and the wise king. And we learned to not only count the cost of discipleship, but also the main message of that parable was to be aware of the dangers that could pull us as Christians away from Christ, all the outside factors that Jesus warned them about in the New Testament. And we talked about some of the things that could pull us away from Christ. Well, today we're going to get into a well-known parable. And by well-known, I mean most of us that have grown up going to church somewhere have probably learned this parable. And like I said, it's Luke chapter 18, and it begins in verse 9. It says, He, Jesus, also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. Well, like I said, this is a parable that I think many of us have heard before. I don't know if you guys noticed this. This is the first parable we've studied where right off the bat, the author, Luke, kind of explains the meaning right off the bat before he even goes into it. So I think that's kind of interesting. So there's not a lot of mystery about what this parable is about, but there are some things that I would like us to think about tonight. Okay? In verse 9, he says that he, Jesus, told this parable to some that trusted themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. So right there we clearly see what Jesus is getting at. But like I said, there's some deeper things going on here. Now, this is what's called an example parable, an example narrative. And what I mean by that is just like the Good Samaritan, Jesus' followers that were there with him listening, and us today, are meant to understand that here's a good example of something and here's a bad example of something. We need to do the good example of something. So that's what I mean by an example narrative. There's an example to follow and there's one not to follow. So let's talk about the two characters here. The first character is the Pharisee. Now, we have one of the things that we've talked about ad nauseum since, I don't know, last year when I first started preaching, is just the Pharisees, okay? It seems like they are always the enemies of Jesus. They are always plotting against him, and they're always trying to trick him. Now, this is something interesting. I didn't know this until just the other day. Pharisees were not like paid clergy, okay? They were not the paid clergy. They were just lay people, but they were very influential among Jews in the Roman Empire. You see, they differentiated themselves from the Sadducees, which is another sect of Judaism, in that the Pharisees prided themselves on certain things. One of the things that they prided themselves on was they rejected any kind of Greek influence, all right? So there was some Greek influence that had kind of permeated into Judaism, and these guys prided themselves on staying away from anything that was a Greek influence. That's called Hellenization, okay? So that's one of the things that made them separate. But they were also very focused, and after studying the Pharisees so much, we can kind of tell by their language, they were very concerned with a few things that are very specific to Judaism, like the temple rites, and the specific rituals, and the services that went into worshiping God. Excuse me. Just to emphasize their influence over the people, Josephus, this first century historian that we've talked about so many times, Josephus, whom historians think was a Pharisee himself, claimed that the Pharisees were so well regarded that anything they said, whether it was a criticism of a high priest or even a king, was believed by the people as fact. So, in short, this sect of Judaism was extremely focused on strict observance of Jewish scripture and ritual, and they looked down on those that were not as strict. And all of this, like I said, probably aligns with all of our perceptions that we've already noted about the Pharisees. Now, there's the Pharisee. Now let's look at the tax collector. Okay, it says that this tax collector comes to the temple. All right, so that implies that he's very likely Jewish. That's important. In the Roman Empire, tax collectors were kind of like independent contractors. Their job under the Roman government was to collect local taxes, local tolls, things like that. And often they would bid for the right to collect these taxes, and they would bid for the right to collect them in a certain place. Obviously, wealthier places would mean a higher bid to get to collect taxes there, right? So, now, one of the big things that I didn't really think about is that the tax collectors got their salaries from the taxes they collected. And this is why people would automatically accuse them of ripping them off. They would say, oh, look at these guys. They're charging so much just because that's where they get their salary from. I don't really owe that many taxes to the Roman Empire. So, I didn't know that, but they would pull their salary out of this, and that's why they were often accused of dishonesty and collecting more than they were supposed to so they could line their pockets and collect more for their salaries. As a matter of fact, Luke later on, when he talks about Zacchaeus confesses as much when he says, if I've cheated anyone out of anything, I will pay it back 4 times, right? So Zacchaeus kind of admits, I may have cheated some people in the past, I'm going to pay it back 4 times. That's what he says to Jesus. So, what does this all mean? Well, if you think about it, here is a Jewish tax collector, basically a traitor to the Jews themselves, a Jewish person working for the Roman Empire, extorting money from his own people. And I know a lot of people in here, they watch The Chosen. And guys, that is exactly, at the very early seasons, exactly what Matthew does. Nobody likes Matthew in the season because he's a Jewish tax collector. He can't even go out in the public without getting the threat of getting beaten on his own. So, here's a traitor to the Jews, and not only that, he is tax collecting where? At the temple, which is a sacred place. So it's almost blasphemy or sacrilegious that he's collecting taxes in a holy temple. Now, that is the setting, and those are the 2 characters that Jesus says in this parable. Now, let's look at their prayers, okay? Well, the Pharisee's prayer focuses on contrasting himself with other people, and especially the tax collector. And he is thankful to God for his own righteous works. He even says that he's thankful that he's not like criminals. And he says, even this tax collector. Do you guys see that he just pointed out a guy that was standing there? He says, I'm so thankful I'm not like the thieves and adulterers and the rogues and this tax collector. he puts the tax collector in the exact same category as hard criminals. And then, this is interesting, the Pharisee explains to God his pious deeds. He says that he fasts twice a week, and he gives 1/10 of his income. Now, let's pause right there for a second, all right? First of all, it was common to pray aloud. So in this parable, it is implied that if others had been around in the situation, they would have audibly heard both the both the Pharisee and the tax collector pray out loud. And so when he's saying these things out loud, people would have heard him, right? Oh, I do all these things. I tithe 1/10 of my income. I fast twice a week. They would have heard that. Okay? Now, here's something else. Even though the law of Moses, which we've been reading in our chronological readings, stipulated that fasting was commanded only during the Day of Atonement once a year. Yom Kippur, we call that today. All right? That was the only time that they were supposed to fast. Even though Jews were only supposed to fast one time out of the year, they had begun to practice fasting more frequently than simply one time in order to show their remorse or their penitence, or they would show their virtuous living. Some primary sources indicate that Jews fasted on Mondays or Thursdays, or Mondays and Thursdays. So here was a Pharisee that was saying this. He was saying, look at me, God. I fast on both Mondays and Thursdays. And even though, God, you only require me to do it once a year, I do it twice a week. Now he also reminds God, look at me, I always tithe 1/10 of my income. Right? So, now real quick, nothing about what the Pharisee is doing or saying is wrong in and of itself. It's his attitude that's the problem. There's nothing wrong with fasting more often. There's nothing wrong with tithing 1/10 of his income. It's his heart that is wrong, especially his condescending attitude towards other people. Now, let's look at the tax collector's prayer. All right, now, the tax collector does a few things that would indicate to a Jewish audience. Remember, guys, who was Jesus telling these parables to? Primarily a Jewish audience, in this case, his disciples. All right? And this would indicate to the Jewish audience that Jesus was speaking about a person that showed extreme humility, this action. One of the things that shows humility is his belief in his own unworthiness. Secondly, he refuses, the tax collector, to look up to heaven. Forgot to tell you this, but when the Pharisees often prayed, they would look up to heaven and they would put their hands up. Right? So, here's the tax collector. What's he do? He is ashamed of himself. He will not even look towards heaven. He will not even think about looking up towards heaven. And what else does he do? He prays a little bit away off, right? He doesn't even feel worthy to be anywhere near the front of the temple. He feels so unworthy in front of God. So here, the tax collector is shown by Jesus to do the exact opposite of the Pharisee. Now, next Jesus says he beat his breast. Now, who cares, right? I mean, we could all see like, somebody getting mad and beating their breast out of frustration. Well, interestingly enough, this was a dramatic gesture that was usually done by women, not by men. So for a man to show this behavior, this would be completely out of the ordinary. Kind of like we talked about when the prodigal son's father ran to him, right? For an older Jewish male to run would have been seen as not good behavior. Okay? So, here is not normal behavior for a Jewish male to beat their breast in public. And look at his simple words. All right? Very simply, he says, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. So here's a person, unlike the Pharisee, who had everything wrong with himself and his actions, but you know what was right? His heart. You know, one of the things that I've learned about going through the Old Testament is that God was concerned with people's hearts every bit as much as their actions, if not more. And there are so many examples of this in the old law where God says, if someone sins, but they're not aware of what they've done, wait till they're aware before they bring a sacrifice to the altar. And this shows me that God didn't want the Israelite sacrifices, and it didn't mean something to them. He didn't want their mindless obedience. It wasn't important to God. Their hearts were what God wanted. You know, when I think back to that student in my class, you know what? I had that kid's heart, and I didn't even know it. I mean, I had a good relationship with the kid. I had like a good rapport with that kid. We joked around about life and talked outside of class. But I did not know that I had that kid's intellectual heart. I wanted him so much to act like the students that I associated good behaviors with. But you know what I had? I had his heart. All right? And I wonder how many of those students, I didn't really have their hearts, I just had their behaviors. And that's what God wants from us. God doesn't want our mindless actions without our heart. So, what can we do with this? Well, there's a few lessons that I would pull out of this parable. One lesson is that we as Christians are not to think of ourselves more highly than others. You know, this is one of the things that always pops up around Jesus, is this humility. Don't judge. Don't think of yourself highly more than others. And I thought to myself, you know, what kinds of things could Christians be like this Pharisee about? Well, growing up, one of the common criticisms that I heard against others was church attendance. I know that people were always quick to point out the people that didn't show up for Sunday morning Bible study, or maybe the people that didn't show up on Wednesday nights. And when I look at this parable, it makes me immediately think about this Pharisee that says, God, look at me. I know that I'm only commanded to fast one day, but I also fast on Mondays, and I fast on Thursdays. And I think to myself, man, how much like a Pharisee can we be as Christians sometimes? And, you know, I've never known Christians to be like this, but perhaps maybe somebody might boast of their contributions. I've never known somebody to be like that. Look how much money I gave, all right? Maybe waving their money around before they drop it. I've never seen that, guys, all right? But I'm just saying there are things that Christians can behave like a Pharisee about. Look at me. I know you only command me to do this, but I do this, this, and this. So, we are never as Christians to look down on other people. Number 2, Christians should approach God with humility. Look at the tax collector. Wouldn't even look up to heaven. Prayed a little bit of ways from the temple. He felt so unworthy talking to God. And his prayer was simple. He said, God, be merciful to me. I am a sinner. Oh, that Christians could all, we as Christians, could all be that humble when we talk to God, we talk to others. Number 3, another lesson we can pull out of this is God exalts the humble. He brings down the prideful. Who went down to their home justified? Just like the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus made the good guy of the parable someone in real life who was detested, and the bad guy someone who was respected. Like I said last week, how many times does Jesus have to put these kinds of things in his disciples' mind about not being better than other people, not judging other people? And then the last thing I kind of get out of this is what I've already talked to you about. Who went down to their home justified? It was the guy that had the right heart, right? The one that was humble, not the one that did everything right, but the guy that knew he did everything wrong and was sorrowful for it. That's the guy that Jesus said, this guy went down to his home justified. Let's pray. Dear God, we come to you this time, Father, and we ask that you be with our hearts, Lord. We ask God that we can be humble, Lord, and not think that we're better than we ought to be, Father. And that when we approach you, Lord, help us always to remember we don't deserve anything you've given us, God. But we're so thankful that you give us what you have. Lord, please help us always have the heart of this tax collector. And Lord, guard our hearts from ever being arrogant like the heart of the Pharisee in this parable, Lord. We ask all these things in your Son's name. Amen. Well, guys, I hope you guys got something out of that. Like I said, it is a parable that we've all probably heard before. And maybe I hope I give you some things to think about that you haven't thought about before. As always, we like to offer, it's our tradition here at the Church of Christ, we like to offer what we call the invitation. And the invitation is simply, we're going to sing a song here in a second. And if you're going through something difficult, you're struggling with something in life, you can come forward and tell me about it. And then I can bring it before the church and we can pray. And we can try to meet your needs. But the invitation is also open for anybody that has not started that walk with Jesus. And you want to start that walk. You want to become a Christian. You want to come forward and confess that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and be baptized and wash away your sins and clothe yourself with Christ. Well, the invitation is also open for you to do that. But if you have any need, we're going to sing a song here in a second, Abide With Me. And if you have any need, please come forward as we stand and sing the song and let me know your needs. Let's sing.